it's a real pleasure, and we're very privileged, I feel, to have Gwen and Andrei, Gwen Burnyeat and Andrei Gomez-Suarez with us tonight. First of all, Andrei, a Colombian writer, international relationship scholar, and peace practitioner. Those three aspects to him as a person. You're currently the senior fellow at the Center for Religion, Reconciliation and Peace in Winchester, which we'd love to know a little more about in the Peace Group here. And you specialize in conflict resolution, peace negotiations, and dialogue. That's your whole area. Gwen, you have been until recently at Merton College, and you've just been appointed as a lecturer up in the University of Edinburgh in social anthropology. You're not only a peace practitioner and anthropologist, but a writer and a filmmaker as well. So multifaceted person. You have worked in Colombia on peace, conflict and politics for over 14 years. And that's what your focus is going to be on tonight, on peace building in Colombia, including the peace process with the FARC and the peace community of San José de Apartadó, and the situation today in Colombia. And we are delighted that you were able to be on Zoom with us and to give your presentation. And we look forward enormously to listening to what you have to say. Thank you. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Anne and Sally, for this wonderful. We met Sally very much by coincidence, and just in our kind of last, one of our last evenings in Merton College, just before we moved up here to Edinburgh, and we were so excited to find a peace group in Abingdon, and also so sorry to be leaving Oxfordshire just as we met, but very happy to be here this evening. So I thought what we're going to do is we're going to kind of try and speak back and forth between us for approximately 35 minutes, and we'll try and do a kind of double act and tell you a bit about the work that we've been doing. We're also husband and wife. That was maybe not in our bios, but I guess that's...
If it doesn't work, I hope it doesn't reflect the state of the relationship.
We practice peace building at home too. So I'm going to start off by giving a brief overview, just a few words about the Colombian conflict, because in case not everyone is familiar with it, and a bit about how I came to work in Colombia, and then we'll hand over to Andrei, and we'll kind of try and do 2 slots each and see how that goes. And we obviously really look forward to your questions afterwards. So the Colombian armed conflict is perhaps not that well known in the UK as other world conflicts. It's the longest running conflict in the Western Hemisphere, and it's been going for well over 50 years, depending on how you count it. Some people say it goes back 200 years, because really since independence in the early 1800s, there's been one cycle of violence has fed into the next, and there's been a kind of constant recycling. But we refer to the current armed conflict started in the 1960s with various guerrilla groups, including the FARC guerrilla, which is the largest, or was until very recently, the largest guerrilla group in Colombia, and the oldest in the Western Hemisphere. And they sort of started leftist guerrilla groups in the shadow of the Cold War, arose to try and fight the state, where they saw various injustices, including very unequal distribution of land, power, wealth, and so on and so forth. And then the state set up some right-wing paramilitary groups, and these got involved in drug trafficking. And there's been a sort of dirty war involving left-wing guerrillas, right-wing paramilitaries, and state armed forces, which has evolved and had various different phases, which we won't go into now, because what we really want to talk about this evening is the role of civil society peace building in the midst of this very complex and territorially different and temporally different conflict. And of course, as in all wars, the civil society has been the most badly affected by the Colombian armed conflict. And just to give you a few numbers, there's been well over 7 million forced displacements, internal and exile, over 200,000 forced disappearances, lots of kidnapping, selective assassinations, landmines, sexual violence in the framework of war, pretty much all of the horrendous atrocities that are committed in war on civilians have occurred in the Colombian context. But of course, the civilians in the midst of war are not just sufferers of history, but they are also agents of very inspiring, creative ways of surviving and taking care of each other and building peace in the midst of war. And I'm sure, the work that you do, you're all very familiar with other inspiring groups and individuals and communities worldwide who are doing very difficult work in contexts like that. And that's how I first came to know and fall in love with Colombia, was working with some of these communities. And I first went out there, I ended up going out there to work with an NGO called Peace Brigades International, which does international accompaniment work to human rights defenders in conflict zones around the world. And one of the communities that I was accompanying was called the Peace Community of San José de Apartadó. And I did this work with this NGO for 2 years, but the peace community really kind of inspired me and changed my life, because I was so kind of inspired and amazed by their courage and their creativity in the midst of circumstances that I had never, been able to witness before, to see what they were able to do. And what they did was, it's a rural community in the northwest zone of Urabá, which has been one of the epicenters of the Colombian conflict. And they decided to declare themselves neutral to the armed conflict. They were trapped between the guerrillas, the paramilitaries, and the state, and they decided to say no to all of them. And it's a kind of interesting idea of neutrality, because it wasn't really neutrality. It was actually a very active positioning of rejecting war, rejecting violence, kind of like a Gandhian non-violent stance. And they were one of the first communities to declare themselves neutral. There have also been other peace communities that were subsequently formed in Colombia in similar circumstances. And I decided to become an anthropologist, to basically try and find a way of carrying on working with them as an individual, no longer as part of an NGO. And so I went to the National University of Colombia in Bogota, and I studied a master's in anthropology. And I spent part of my time in Bogota doing my classes, and part of my time in Urabá doing field work, and focusing in particular on their production of organic fair trade cacao. And I was looking at their everyday practices of chocolate production and how you could kind of understand their peace building identity and their peace building work through their everyday work as farmers in the midst of war, producing food, but also designing alternative ways of living together as a community with democratic forms of organization, with kind of community work ethics, with not just saying no to war and denouncing human rights violations, but also having their own education system, their own collective cooperative economic system around the cacao and things like that. And I ended up writing my first book about them and producing a film, which you can watch, called Chocolate of Peace. It's freely available online. It's on my website, or it's on chocolateofpeace.com. And that was sort of a little bit about that's all I'm going to say about the peace community now. We can talk more about them afterwards, but I kind of wanted to introduce them as an example of the work that I think so many similar, equally inspiring and courageous groups do in Colombia, of bottom-up peace building, of sort of rural civilians in the midst of war, who are very much identify as victims of the state and very much reject the state. They reject everything to do with the Colombian state. They don't want to participate in national peace initiatives. They're kind of living outside of all of those sorts of things. And that was a very particular view of peace. But in the middle of this story, but before I became an anthropologist, in between working with PBI and becoming an anthropologist, I was back in London for 6 months, and I met Andrei, who recruited me into a very different kind of civil society peace building organization, Rodeemos el Dialogo. And so I'm going to hand over to Andrei now.
Well, let me try to connect some of the things that Gwen has said with Rodeemos el Dialogo, also giving you another dimension of the history of Colombia. And is that as I'm Colombian, as it was said at the beginning, and I'm now working at the University of Winchester and Rodeemos el Dialogo. And it's thanks to the work that I've done with Rodeemos el Dialogo that I believe that the center decided to hire me as a senior research fellow, because I had practitioner experience as well as an academic credentials of the scholarship that I write about. And so I'll tell you a bit more about the center towards the end, and probably we can do that in the Q&A in order to keep the flow of the conversation. But I grew up in the middle of this armed conflict in Colombia, and the FARC created a political party in the 1980s called the Patriotic Union. And there is a connection that Gwen and I have discussed a lot between the peace community of San José de Apartadó and the Patriotic Union, the political party that was created by the FARC in the middle of the first peace process between the Colombian government and the FARC. My parents were members of that political party. 5,000 members of the political party were killed. I ended up writing my PhD on the destruction of this political party. And what these people wanted to do in that party was to take over power and do top-down peace building. So the idea was we need to get hold of the state institutions and try to transform the reality of Colombia. But of course, doing that after the killing of more than 5,000 members of the party became impossible. So for me, as growing up in Colombia, peace became something that was quite something that we did not talk about at home. In 2012, when the peace process between the FARC and the government started, between the Colombian government on the head of Juan Manuel Santos and the FARC started in 2012, somehow I felt that there was a second opportunity for me to do what my parents didn't manage to do in the 1980s. But I had never really worked as a member of a political party, so I didn't really know how to do the contribution that I wanted to do. And by chance, I met, after finishing my PhD at Sussex, I met a group of people, some Colombians and some friends of Colombia, like you, who were interested in trying to find ways to support the peace process between the government and the FARC. And they didn't really know, because they were not peace builders, they had not studied conflict resolution, they didn't know how to do it. But what they thought, what they wanted to do was to surround dialogue, to surround the dialogue, or to embrace the dialogue that was taking place between the FARC and the government in Havana. And I was one of the first members to join, because I was invited to the first meeting of these people, but I couldn't make it because I was traveling between Bogota and the UK. That's the way how Rodeemos el Dialogo was born. We call it in English, Embrace Dialogue. It was set up in October 2012 with the idea that the first thing that we needed to do as civil society was to get a bit more information of what was happening in Havana, in particular because those negotiations between the government and the FARC had the principle of confidentiality, which meant that people could not get enough information to know what was happening in Havana, and that was used by the people opposing the peace process to spread misinformation. So the first thing that we did was, let's try to inform ourselves. We started to organize meetings. We invited some of the key stakeholders of the negotiations in Colombia. We brought them to London, and we did a first event in London to try to share with other Colombians the views of people who were near the negotiation table or who had been analyzing peace processes in Latin America, to learn from them and what lessons we could learn. That meeting, that conference that was at LSE, was a really important conference for us, because we heard something that a peace practitioner told us. His name is Christian Herzboheimer, and he used to work for Conciliation Resources in London. And he said to us in that conference that there were multiple paths to peace, that it was not only the government and the FARC building peace in Havana, but that civil society had a role to play. And that the important thing was for civil society to understand where it was standing in the middle of those processes that were unfolding, and that we needed to create our own path to peace. I mean, I guess for you, all of people who have been working on peace building for a while, that's not a revelation. But for us, it was a total revelation, because we moved from the idea of being a passive observers to be actors. And we felt that every single activity that we could do in London was part of peace building. And that changed our own feeling about the role that we could play. Out of that, first thing that we did is when we met Gwen, because we started doing some closed-door dialogues with 23 people. It was by invitation only. We invited them because we thought that they were representative of different sectors of Colombian society and the international community. And what we did in those first 5 closed-door dialogues was to get some ideas about what was happening in each one of the rounds of negotiations that were taking place in Havana. And out of that, we decided to write very short statements of 1,000 words that summarize the concerns of the people in those meetings. And those reports were sent to Havana, to the negotiation table, to both parties, for them to try to see what was happening with civil society so far away from Colombia, and what were the concerns that they could perceive from what was happening behind closed doors in the negotiations. This, for us, when we felt that we were becoming actors, and that we were having, even though no one was talking about Rodeemos el Dialogo, we were having a direct connection to the negotiation table, made us feel that it was time for us to go to Colombia. So in 2014, Gwen and I jumped on a plane and went back to Colombia and decided to join forces and set up the chapter of Rodeemos el Dialogo in Colombia. We started selling the cacao of the peace community of San José de Apartadó in a series of peace breakfasts that we did, in which we were inviting people in the early 9 o'clock in the morning of Colombia on Saturdays to talk about the peace process, sharing a hot chocolate produced by a community that had declared itself neutral in the middle of the armed conflict. So we were creating awareness that there was a bottom-up strategy of building peace, at the same time that there was a top-down strategy of negotiating in Havana, and that we all were part of the same ecosystem. And so we did that in 2014, and out of that, in 2016, when the FARC and the government signed the peace agreement and decided to run a referendum in order for Colombians to endorse the final peace agreement that was 297 pages long, we, Rodeemos el Dialogo, decided to do pedagogy about that peace agreement. And we started rallying the whole country. We started going to schools. We started going to unions. We started going to universities. We went to more than 50 municipalities across the whole country with Gwen and with other members of the organization to explain to people from an emotional perspective, more than from a rational perspective, what was the importance of the peace agreement between the Colombian government and the FARC. And we failed. We failed because, to some extent, we can get into the Q&A, but the reason why I'm gonna call this a failure is because the day that the referendum was run, the no campaign won for 50,000 votes. So that meant that the Colombian peace agreement was rejected by the Colombian people. And that made it very difficult for the government to implement a peace agreement, and the government had to open a renegotiation of the peace agreement to try to move forward. And Gwen actually I wrote a book about how the No campaign promoted misinformation and captured the imagination and the feelings of a sector of Colombian civil society. But Gwen did a really important work in understanding why the government lost. And so she is going to tell us a bit more about that and what happened in that moment.
So I guess before I get onto that, I just want to, building off what Andrei has said, maybe just say a couple of words about the peace agreement itself. So this has been, as Andrei said, it was 297 pages long. It was celebrated internationally as the world's most comprehensive peace accord so far, because it wasn't just about ending the armed conflict between the FARC and the government. It was also about making all sorts of structural transformations to pave the way, not only to be able to end the conflict with the remaining armed groups, because there are other guerrilla groups and paramilitary groups still active, but also to prevent resurgence of violence, because of course the structural inequalities have fed into the reason of the conflict in the first place, and they have of course been massively exacerbated by war. And so there is land reform, there is political reform, there's all sorts of things, also all kinds of transitional justice measures set up to provide redress for the over 8 million victims of the Colombian conflict, including a truth commission, a transitional justice court, and various other things as well. So it was very, very kind of worldwide admired, and it had all sorts of international expertise involved. People came from Northern Ireland, from the Philippines, from South Africa to talk about what they had been through in their countries and offer expertise and, you know, comparative ideas for the Colombian negotiators. And, you know, it all sounds great. So who's going to say no to peace? But during the whole time of the negotiations, from 2012 to 2016, there was a strong opposition to the peace negotiations, in particular led by former President Álvaro Uribe, who had been president before Santos, and one of his main reasons for his popularity, he was a very popular president, was his very strong hardline military stance against the FARC guerrilla, which for some sectors of Colombian society, they felt it restored security to the countryside and enabled people to do business and things that they hadn't been able to do. And for other members of Colombian society, he was the government that was presiding over a record number of human rights violations, in particular by the state against civilians. People like the peace community who I had worked with, they suffered record human rights violations by the army under Uribe's mandate. So there's all sorts of civil society. We're not trying to sort of only present one view, but certainly there was a lot of kind of human rights violations under Uribe. So he had opposed the peace negotiations since the beginning, partly because he felt that Santos was betraying his legacy, and presumably partly because he didn't want some of the human rights violations to be investigated. But there's lots of speculation there as to why. Anyway, when the peace referendum was announced, that Santos said, well, we've reached a final agreement and we're going to have a referendum on the deal. He kind of did it to try to shut Uribe up, in the same way that David Cameron thought that by holding a referendum on Brexit, he would shut the ERG up. And that's a risky business. If it had worked, we would have been here telling a very different story, but it didn't, and it lost by 50.2%. And so after the referendum, I became very interested, as Andrei said, in why the yes lost, because we had done so much. And I was about to start my PhD, and in fact, I had my PhD proposal all ready to go. I went to UCL with this proposal saying, I'm going to do research on why the referendum won, thanks to the efforts of civil society peace pedagogy, like all of the work that we had been doing. And we saw so many other groups doing really, really incredible efforts, putting all of their work on hold, NGOs of all shapes and sizes, from your local victims association in a tiny municipality to the big teachers union. Everyone put all of their resources and efforts into trying to convince people to vote yes and explain this complicated 300-page peace accord. I used my film to try to go around the country and show people this story of the peace community. I guess relevant to say here, one of the extraordinary things about Colombia is that most of the war has taken place in the rural areas. So a lot of people in the urban areas haven't experienced the war firsthand. And so people like the peace community. I mean, when I said to my friends in Bogota, I'm going to Urabá to visit, to do my fieldwork in the peace community, they looked at me like I was mad. You know, what are you going to go to Urabá for? That's full of guerrillas and drug traffickers. And so there's a kind of stigmatization of those regions, and there's also a sort of disconnect, which is a disconnect which of course exists also in the UK between the rural and the urban. We don't know each other's worlds, but the conflict has exacerbated that much more in Colombia. And so that's also partially one of the rather simplistic, but we can go into more details, explanations for why the larger voting areas with more populations in sort of big cities, often many of them voted no, and the rural areas where the conflict had been worst voted yes. Anyway, I became very interested in why the yes had lost, and so I had done this PhD proposal saying why, you know, what had the civil society groups done, and then I suddenly found myself thinking, well, actually, I need to focus on the government, because everyone was blaming the government, much like they did here during the Brexit, in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum. People blamed the government in Colombia of Santos, saying, you guys didn't do enough peace pedagogy. People didn't know what they were voting for. People were duped by the opposition, who told lies, saying things like, it will turn Colombia communist, it will make children gay, it will impose homosexuality in schools, all kinds of mad stuff. So I went and I spent a year doing anthropology of the state. So anthropologists, we go and hang out with people who we study, but of course the state is also people. So I went and I spent a year hanging out with the government officials in the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace, which is the branch of the government in charge of peace negotiations, and also in charge of explaining the peace negotiations to Colombian society using what they called peace pedagogy. And I was very interested in what they had done before the referendum, but I was even more interested in what they were going to do after the referendum, because after the referendum, everyone was suddenly really concerned about trying to elect a president in the next presidential elections, which were just a year and a half away, to ensure that the next president would be committed to implementing the peace accord, because the peace accord was renegotiated, and it was not put to another referendum. It was modified according to some of the demands that the No campaign had made, and began to be implemented. It was approved by Congress and began to be implemented in January 2017. And 50,000 members of the FARC, 13,000 people from the FARC disarmed. The Truth Commission was set up, and implementation began, but in this context of polarization, in which everything to do with the peace process was, split the country into friends and enemies, and yes and no. And in this office, they were trying very hard to explain the peace agreement, kind of partly to try to get people to vote for a president who would continue to respect it. But they had come up against this problem of distrust, which I knew very well from the peace community. They distrust the state because the state has been a victimizer in the war. They distrust the state because they feel that the state always promises things and then doesn't implement, or makes promises in political campaigns and then doesn't deliver. And so all sorts of civil society groups around the country were hearing these complicated presentations by these very well-intentioned, well-educated, committed and hardworking government officials who were going from Bogota to different regions to explain the peace accord and what was being done in the implementation. But people sort of didn't believe any of it because they were the state. And it's very difficult to get across a message from the state in that context, because of course it just seems like government propaganda. And anyway, nobody believes anything the state says in a context where the state has committed atrocities. And so how do you rebuild that trust with the state? And the people I was working with were very much coming up against that problem. And in that moment, we, with Andrei and with Rodeemos el Dialogo, we did a project together with this office, with the government, to try to use art to build new narratives, to mobilize wider society around peace. And we worked with artists and musicians and school teachers around the country, brought them together using a state budget and a state kind of apparatus to bring people together to try to think how to do this. And Rodeemos el Dialogo was one of the organizations that got on board with this. And it did end up producing a fantastic song called Trust, precisely talking a bit about the need for trust in these contexts. But ultimately, it was a very tricky project to run because of the distrust between the participants, because the participants in the project wanted to do the project, wanted to create these outputs to mobilize. They agreed on the objective of mobilizing society around peace, but they didn't really trust the government at all. And so, unfortunately, the song was not released in time to have much of an impact. And in 2018, the same people who had opposed the peace deal then managed to campaign on their success and continue opposing the peace deal, and they won the presidency. And Ivan Duque, who was president from 2018 to 2022, had basically won his election on a platform promising to do away with the peace accord or make serious modifications to the peace accord. So that's sort of a bit about, and that was my PhD project. And my second book was really about the problem of trust in state-society relations in peace processes, and the problem of using kind of liberal, rational explanations as a way of trying to counteract disinformation, because of course, it doesn't work. We saw that here in Brexit too. You can't explain things to people because people's political opinions are based on emotions, on culture, on identity, on history, on very complex forces, and not only on processes of rationality. So then we felt that we had failed again. After one failure in 2016, in 2018, we failed again. Andrei and I moved back to the UK. I had to write up my PhD and find my way through all of what I'd been witnessing and write something about it. And we reactivated Rodeemos el Dialogo in the UK. And I'll hand back over to Andrei at that point.
So to try to start wrapping up. So yeah, in 2018, as Gwen said, we heartbroken, landed back in London. The team that we had left in London in 2014 did not exist anymore because everyone full of hope had decided to jump on a plane and go back to Colombia and become peace builders there. So we needed to start from scratch. We both were quite similar to now in a way. We both were at UCL. I was an honorary research fellow at the UCL Institute of the Americas, and Gwen was doing her PhD, and we set up Rodeemos el Dialogo again in London, and we started defending the implementation of the peace agreement of, in particular, of the president of Colombia, who started campaigning and doing lots of policies against it. We had to go to parliament and to put pressure on the UK government to make sure that the monies that had been allocated from the UK government for the peace implementation were looked after, that they put diplomatic pressure on the Duque administration, that the transitional justice institutions that had been created, like the Truth Commission, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, that is a tribunal of transitional justice, and the unit of the search for the disappeared people, that is a humanitarian unit searching for more than 150,000 disappeared people that we have in Colombia, were going to be protected from the efforts of the Duque administration to undermine the autonomy of these institutions. You know, this being in the UK for us was really important. We left a really strong team in Bogota, but, you know, most of the important headlines that we got in Colombian media was thanks to the work that we were doing in London, in a way, because when you have the UK government, you know, complaining about the lack of funding for the Truth Commission, that would hit the news in Colombia, and then the national newspapers would somehow make a news out of that, and then we will somehow have some influence on that. We also decided to support the work of the Colombian Truth Commission. The Colombian Truth Commission is perhaps, you know, if you think about South Africa as the landmark of truth commissions in the 1990s, I would say that Colombia is nowadays the new landmark, is the new blueprint for truth commissions in the world. It's been the most ambitious truth commission in many different ways, but perhaps what I want to highlight for you is that it's the first truth commission in the world that tried to take testimonies in more than 24 countries across the world from people in exile. One of those countries was the United Kingdom. So in the United Kingdom, we had helped to set up a hub of civil society organizations who ended up taking testimonies of victims in England, and do not only taking the testimonies, but doing lots of psychosocial support events and activities to acknowledge the suffering of some of the people who had to flee the country in order to survive the violence. Violence, as Gwen said, from the state, from paramilitary groups, from guerrilla groups. I was one of the people on behalf of Rodeemos el Dialogo, but also, who took testimonies. We collected in the UK around 100 testimonies of people from different paths in life. We, in general, the Truth Commission collected more than 2,000 testimonies from across the world and more than 30,000 testimonies in Colombia. And we supported the work of the Truth Commission, not only in the United Kingdom, but also in Colombia, with the work that a team that was working on pedagogy was doing, but also a team working on with the youth. All of these somehow help the Truth Commission to deliver something that has been quite positive for civil society, despite COVID. This is the only Truth Commission in the world that had to work in the middle of COVID. So most of the testimonies that we had to take, we ended up taking them on Zoom. But people were very skeptical of giving testimonies about the violence that they had suffered on Zoom because no one was used to Zoom. So it was a challenging moment. And the way how the government handled the COVID pandemic in Colombia, that was quite, sort of strict in not letting people go to the streets. It was a way of exercising social control that had a positive impact on the spread of COVID in some ways, had a really sort of negative impact on people who were very unhappy with the lack of implementation of the peace agreement and who had started doing social mobilizations in the streets before COVID hit. And so that created a really serious sense of sort of anger from civil society. And in 2021, between 2020 and 2021, we had some big demonstrations across the whole country in the biggest cities of Colombia. It was called the estallido social, a bit like in Chile, people taking the streets, hundreds of thousands of people taking the streets, something that we hadn't seen in Colombia since the 1970s. And that sense of sort of insatisfaction that was experienced by people was captured by Gustavo Petro. Gustavo Petro was a leftist candidate who has been a former guerrilla fighter in the 1980s, and he started campaigning for the presidency, and he was elected in 2022 as the first ever leftist president of Colombia in 200 years of Republican history. And that gave us a new sense of hope that made us feel that for 4 years, we had been working, really against the worst of the conditions. And suddenly a president was there who had campaigned in favor of the peace agreement and who was elected with the idea that he wanted to make peace with all the different insurgencies. So now he has started something that he calls total peace. His peace agenda is a very ambitious agenda because many people thought that what he was going to do was to start negotiations only with the leftist insurgencies. But he has decided that he wants to talk to everyone, to all the legal armed groups. And some of them are not considered political actors, but they are considered just groups of organized crime, big groups of transnational organized crime. And so, in a way, what we are doing in Rodeemos el Dialogo now is supporting this very ambitious peace agenda. We have set up a team of people following more than 8 negotiation tables that are taking place at the same time in Colombia to try to understand the progress, because it's very difficult to keep track of what is going on when you have 8 negotiation tables. And we've been supporting that. We've been following each one of the negotiation tables. And then the other thing that we have been doing is, now that the Truth Commission has finished the mandate and has published the final report, we have been supporting the dissemination of the final report of the Truth Commission. And this year, we have a big responsibility. That is, we are the host, or we are the the curators, to put it in some ways, of the exhibition of the final report of the Colombian Truth Commission that is going to be presented in Bogota over the whole year for people to be aware of what was the final report produced. In all of this work that I keep doing with Rodeemos el Dialogo, as you can see, I spent a lot of time of my life doing this. I'm the non-executive director, and now they call me the general director. I try to don't have a name or whatever, but Winchester has been absolutely fundamental, because Winchester has seen in Rodeemos el Dialogo a very clear, innovative organization that has lots of potential to do peace building in Colombia and take those peace building lessons from Colombia to the world. So Rodeemos el Dialogo is not only one of the partners of the Winchester Center for Religion, Reconciliation and Peace on documenting cases of unarmed civilian protection, but is actually also setting up a series of dialogues. I will share with you now an Eventbrite page that we are doing an event, because we are doing a series of dialogues on on reconciliation, and we call them critical dialogues on reconciliation, to try to share lessons from Colombia and from different places in the world, and they are run online. And finally, of course, we've been spreading also the opportunities of the scholarships that we offer for our masters on reconciliation and peace building amongst peace builders in Colombia, because at the center we run an MA online option, masters for students all over the world to take this course, and we want to get more Colombians to study with us and to strengthen their peace building skills. And you're also very welcome to join us if you want, and then we will discuss more about Rodeemos el Dialogo there. But I think Gwen is going to have the final word, because she started, she ends. This is a whole circle.
Because we're a feminist household. Yeah, no, I know we've taken slightly longer than we said, but I think we've managed to squeeze a huge amount into a rather short time. So thank you for bearing with us, and apologies if we've gone rather fast over some very big, complex topics. But I perhaps want to just end with, I guess, one of the conclusions, because we've mentioned top-down and bottom-up peace building, and I think that through all of the experience that we've had with Rodeemos el Dialogo and with our own individual research, I think we've seen the importance of both organizations like the peace community doing grassroots work, the organizations like civil society actors like Rodeemos el Dialogo, and very much like yourselves as well, the work that we can do at a kind of, I suppose, more middle-class peace building level. But also, you can't have peace without the state, and peace is political. And I think that was one of the big conclusions of my PhD work, and what I wrote about in my book was the importance of recognizing this, because quite often there's a sort of fetishization of the local and the small and the micro, but we really need to have the right government in power. And it was a real disaster when Ivan Duque was in power, undermining the peace agreement, and under his watch, hundreds of social leaders, human rights defenders and community activists like the peace community were assassinated, and also over 200 members of the FARC who laid down their weapons in good faith and transitioned into doing politics were also assassinated. And so it's really an amazing opportunity to have Gustavo Petro in power. He's not perfect and he faces many challenges, but we really want to support the peace efforts that he's doing, and it's easier to support those peace efforts being a critical friend when the government is themselves, at least has the stated objective of peace. And the way that we do it, and I'll just end on this, from Rodeemos el Dialogo, is that we believe in building a culture of dialogue, because we think that, and that's why our name, Embrace Dialogue, is so important, because we think it's not just about building peace among friends, but also speaking to people who think differently from us and learning to put ourselves in the shoes of the other, learning to talk to people who voted no in the peace referendum, learning to understand the points of view of people who like Uribe and have right-wing preferences, but also have a concern for the future of their country and also don't want to live in the middle of war, but see the world differently than we do, for example. And I think that's one of the values that Rodeemos el Dialogo has taught both of us. I'm now doing research on polarization in Colombia and Britain. As you can see, I've got an interest in the parallels, the surprising parallels between the two contexts. And I think that, learning about dialogue across difference and seeing the other with compassion and empathy is fundamental requisite for peace. And I think that's part of the self-transformation that we've both undergone through Rodeemos el Dialogo, and which we, I'm sure, have many more challenges to face. And that's it.
Wow.
And thank you. And I'm sorry we've gone in so long, but we'd love to hear your question. We've got no time constraints. So
thank you so much, Gwen and Andrei. You covered an enormous amount in that time that you were talking to us. Tremendous amount. The depth of just almost despair that you must have felt at times, and the hope that the hopes that were raised and then dashed, and you continued on the road with the process that you believed so firmly in. Thank you very much for giving us such an overview. Questions and comments. I think I saw one hand up already, but that's already disappeared. Yeah.
And we're very happy to share resources. We've got, as Andrei mentioned, we've got an event with Embrace Dialogue. I can share it in the chat now. On Thursday, precisely on reconciliation in Colombia, but they're not all on Colombia, I promise, in English. I can share the link to my film. I mean, both of our work is also available online in various forms and stuff. But yeah, we're very happy to share as much as you like.
And we're very eager to hear your comments. And
your thoughts.
That's a dialogue.
Yeah.
Rebecca.
Hi. There doesn't seem to be an option for people to raise their digital hand. So just noting that I think people are going to have to go like this. I just wanted to say to Gwen and Andrei that the richness of your kind of storytelling of your experiences is really, really powerful. And I think that's one of the reasons I think you're, quite amazing voices in this cause, is because of the way that you have told it with such passion and your personal experiences. And so I just wanted to say thank you for the depth and richness of your story. Thank you.
That's a lovely comment, Rebecca. Thank you so much.
But you're right, Rebecca. Peace building is about storytelling, and that's what Gwen has been doing lately. So yeah, it's a story.
See, Peter's got his digital hand up.
Peter.
Yes, thank you. I'd just like to say thank you both for an extraordinary story, really. That it was very inspiring, and I would really appreciate if you could just talk a little bit about how you dealt with. You had obviously many pretty grim setbacks in this whole time, and how did you? Because now, as you tell your story, you have a very sort of even feel about your approach to it all, and you just sort of soldier on. Oh, it almost sounds as if you were unaffected by a mild setback of being defeated in the referendum and so on, but I'm sure it must have been personally very, very shocking, some of the things that happened. And actually, for all of us involved in peace, I think we all have times when we feel sort of really set back by events. And I'd just be really interested in your reflections on how you dealt with those difficult times that challenged what you were trying to do. Thank you.
You should have seen Andrei when we first moved back to the UK in 2018, just after Duque's election. He was like, my life has failed, everything has failed, Colombia is broken, I'm never going to be happy. So it was a very different storytelling then. I think a lot of self-work.
I think you're right. I mean, I think, I'm very lucky, and I'm to have Gwen I really felt I put a heavy weight upon my shoulders for months. It was like being heartbroken. It was really but I sort of peace building cannot be an individual activity. It needs to be part of a group of people who support each other. Sometimes you carry some of the weight, sometimes the other carries the other weight, because there is so much you can do on your own, and that I think is also really important. So I think Rodeemos el Dialogo, and Gwen and I have used it also as a group therapy. Sometimes we just met to vent our disappointment and our concerns, and sometimes some people will have more negative feelings and thoughts than others, and then the others will bring some positive light into, but let's don't forget this, let's look at this, and then you can see some glimmers on the side. Now, at the individual level, I would say, and with this I wrap up my comment, is that I think it's very important to have a healthy lifestyle. So in my personal experience, I constantly, since I became a peace builder, I do meditation on a daily basis, and I run a lot. So I try to work with that and to my diet, and to help me have the best health possible that could contribute to a clear thinking, and to don't take things personally, so that to have an open mind that you can transform obstacles into opportunities. And that's a constant reminder that I try to tell myself, and that we try to remind each other, is we always can transform obstacles into opportunities, and I call that spontaneous peace building.
But I think that also there's a political dimension to this, which is that not only Andrei, but also so many, community activists in Colombia who, live through, Colombia has lived through terrible times, and yet people still get up every day and they care for each other, and they try to make things better, and they try to, find justice, even though they don't believe in justice. They try to go through the steps of getting to justice, and sometimes they have breakthroughs. But the only reason they have those breakthroughs is because of that accumulated capital of constant work in the midst of darkness, when it feels like you're getting nowhere. And I think that's a bit what peace work feels like, is you feel like you're getting nowhere for a long time, and then suddenly there's an opening, things happen, maybe at a national level, a left-wing president is suddenly elected because of a strike, COVID, a series of events, and then suddenly all of these efforts that have been going on for years suddenly are a capital. It's like there's not a vacuum there. There's actually all of these people who've been doing, and suddenly their work, you can look back in retrospective and go, oh, this helped achieve that. And, we look back in retrospective and we can go, of course, we helped achieve the election of Gustavo Petro, and not only Gustavo Petro, but also Francia Marquez, who is the vice president, who is the first ever Black Afro-Colombian female environmental human rights defender from a conflict-torn region and a poor background, who is a single mum and used to be a housekeeper, is the vice president of Colombia. Amazing. I mean, unthinkable, a few years ago. And we, in our tiny, tiny way, maybe contributed a little something to that. And, it's not the result of one person. It's many struggles that fit together that suddenly kind of can flow together. But of course, it can all break again, and that's why I think, if my husband will allow me to do a little bit of a sort of external observation, I think that, he's very he's very modest about all of the work that he's done on himself, and he does put a lot of effort on his shoulders. But also I think that many people like you feel that their efforts have paid off and are able to be at peace with Colombia because of the election of Petro, because that was the failure that had happened so many times. And if in 3 years' time the far right, there is a swing back to the far right, which is a possibility, I'm not sure how easy it's going to be to recompose the pieces. So we can't rest on our laurels. We have to keep trying to take advantage of this window of opportunity which has opened, which is an imperfect window of opportunity. And you know, we need to try and make the most of it. So I think that, you know, yes, you can do all of the meditation you like, but ultimately you're happier because of the political context. And I think that is, you know, inevitable in many ways. And I think it's also just about living with disappointment otherwise.
Yeah.
I see some hands up with France.
Francis, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you very much, and yeah, brilliant, great to see you and hear from you. Well, there's lots of things I was thinking about. One was the Truth Commission. How was that kind of coordinated? If you know, did you just off your own motivation come back and get the 100 testimonies? And were other people doing the same thing? And who received them and who collated them? You know, how was that an interaction between the grassroots and the making it an official body of work?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. I mean, let me just say the following. Grassroots organizations and civil society organizations and human rights defenders had been asking for the Colombian state to create a truth commission for more than 20 years. And the state was very skeptical of doing that. The state didn't really want to do it, actually. But at the end of the day, in the middle of the negotiations between the FARC and the government, they decided to create this official truth commission that was going to be mandated by law in Colombia. So the Truth Commission, in a way, was created by law in 2018, and 11 commissioners were selected by a special committee, international committee, that received proposals from civil society organizations of nominations of people who they thought should be truth commissioners. So civil society was very much involved from the very beginning. Even we, as Rodeemos el Dialogo and other civil society organizations, sent proposals of what was the structure of the Truth Commission that needed to happen in Colombia in order to feel that that Truth Commission was gonna deliver truth and was gonna help to move in the direction of coexistence. Once the Truth Commissioners were elected, were 5 women and 6 men. One of them was elected as the president of the Truth Commission, actually a Jesuit priest called Francisco de Rux. And so he was the president of the Truth Commission. And one of the commissioners, the only international commissioner called Carlos Berinstain, a Spanish psychologist who had been working on previous truth commissions in Central America and South America, he was put in charge of working with the testimonies of the people outside Colombia. So that was his responsibility. So he developed a whole manual, a guideline of how to do testimonies, or how to take testimonies, in order to make sure that the testimonies were themselves as an opportunity for reparation of the victims. Let me tell you that some of these victims hadn't told their story for 40 years. So they had left the country and they had never spoken about it, not even with their children, because they felt that there was not safety in order to talk about this. So some of the organizations that gathered together who were supporting the Truth Commission from before in Colombia offer the support of the Truth Commission and were trained by the Truth Commission to take testimonies. Some others, like us, who had people in Colombia and in the UK, offer our willingness to be trained in order to take the testimonies following the guidelines of the Truth Commission and following all the protocols that we needed to follow in order to take the testimonies and put them into a digital archive where all the information of the testimonies could be analyzed through artificial intelligence and whatever, all these mechanisms of data analysis, and then try to take out and write from there the final report. So that's the way how it was coordinated. So we were linked to Carlos Beristain, the Truth Commissioner, who was mainly rallying the whole world, organizing people in 24 countries, and we were collecting the testimonies for the Truth Commission, and then the with the groups with the victims and the people who gave the testimonies, they would say, we would like an event in this and this and this way, so that we feel that we have been dignified by the Truth Commission.
And listened to by the state.
And so based on those recommendations, we will go and talk to the Truth Commissioner, and the Truth Commissioner will give us money, and then we will set up an event that was shaped in such a way that people felt that was a way to start feeling heard by the truth, by the Colombian state, because the Truth Commission was, at the end of the day, an autonomous entity, but a representative of the state, saying, here is a state that that is listening to you and is willing to acknowledge the dignity of the victims and take responsibility for your future. So that's a bit the way.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant. I just have just a couple of clarities there, because you said something early on about that might lead to coexistence.
Yeah.
And this is one of the problems with truth, is that if you asked me and my mum and we spoke our testimonies, there could easily be a lot incriminating one lot of people, and maybe not so many incriminating us from the other side. And also, how did they make it fair and make it anyway peaceful? And also, how did they deal with corporations, or is it all insurgencies?
Yeah. Those are very important questions. Well, two basic things probably to try to answer your question. The first thing is the Colombian Truth Commission decided not to offer as a promise reconciliation, because in the case of South Africa, it had felt that the Truth Commission had not delivered on that promise of reconciliation. So the idea was coexistence is not reconciliation, is not as deep as connect. So coexistence is we can coexist with two versions of what happened.
Or many versions.
Or many versions. We just need to move on in the same direction, and we don't need to, we can agree to disagree. You know, sort of, that was the whole idea of coexistence.
And the philosophy of the Truth Commission was not, there is one truth and we're going to find out what it is. It was not tasked with writing a singular account of what happened. It was criticized for that by some people, because of course that's what some people wanted it to do. But I think the Truth Commissioners were very aware of the need to create a kind of framework that could accommodate multiple truths. And they were not trying to impose a single truth, but rather it was not about so much the outcome as about the listening and the process by which people were listened to and allowed their stories to be heard.
And now that said, of course, these mechanisms are imperfect, and you're absolutely right. The commission was targeted for criticism, and in a way, you could say that there are sectors of civil society still now who campaign against the Truth Commission, against the final report of the Truth Commission, and that's part of life.
Yeah.
Now, the second thing that I would say is in regards to your question about corporations, the Truth Commission tried to look at the role of some of the transnational companies that participated in the armed conflict in Colombia. And they were in some specific cases that had to do with, you know, the suffering of indigenous communities or peasant communities in San José de Apartadó, in regions of Colombia. They were actually naming some of the companies that participated, and the National Security Archives in the US were open. They offered all their archives for the Truth Commission to analyze them. Now, I will finish by saying one thing that I think is important in the way how the transitional justice mechanism was taught in Colombia. And the Truth Commission was very clearly not seeking to offer judicial truth. It was just seeking to open a huge national debate about how do we come to terms with our past, with the history, with the narrative that we have of our past. And the way how that was done is by giving the full responsibility of judicial accountability to a tribunal that works autonomously from the Truth Commission and that is still working in Colombia at the moment, and that actually last week or 2 weeks ago started talking about the collusion of BP with paramilitary groups in Colombia, because some of the people working on security strategies in the 1980s and 1990s had gone to the special jurisdiction for peace and had started revealing judicial truth. So in a way, the judicial processes in Colombia is still open, and it will be open for another 15 years. So there is a tribunal searching and trying to do this work, but the Truth Commission now has closed the work that they were doing, trying to move things forward.
And perhaps I'll just add to what Andrei said, because I think that the Truth Commission learned quite a lot from the peace process and the failure of the peace pedagogy and the kind of rational explaining model that I had looked at. And one of the ways that they have kind of, I think, taken on board those mistakes is by recognizing the Truth Commission's final report, which is not like a short report of only 300 pages like the peace agreement. It's like 11 volumes of thousands and thousands of pages, plus a whole media archive on a digital website. It's the first transmedia Truth Commission report in the world, which has animations, it has documentary films, it has hours of recordings of public events, of hearings that were done around the world. I mean, it's an incredible resource for kind of students and scholars to study for years to come. But they've sort of seen this whole resource as, well, the utility of this depends on how people appropriate this or not. Of course, it's not just peace that's political. Truth is massively political, and we know this very much in this post-truth era that we live in. And so, of course, the far right and the people who had opposed the peace agreement produced a counter report. They said, we don't agree with anything that's in this report. We're going to produce our own version. And they produced a little pamphlet called What Truth, in which they, took issue with some of the things that they thought the Truth Commission report was saying, in particular, the human rights violations by the army and things like that. But this is part of a contestation in the public sphere, which is normal and healthy and natural and fine. But the important thing of whether we can determine the success of this Truth Commission's efforts or not is really what civil society organizations do with the report and with this transmedia. And Rodeemos el Dialogo is involved in a project which I think is really exciting to support local teachers. So around the country, teachers, both kind of formal teachers in schools and universities, but also informal kind of local pedagogy, community workshop-y type teaching. People are trying to think, well, how can we disseminate the contents of the report? How can we screen these documentaries to communities? How can we teach children this stuff in schools? How can we incorporate this into curriculums? And people around the country are designing pedagogical tools. And there's a project that Rodeemos el Dialogo has to with the Truth Commission to pool these people together and build a network so that the teachers can all share these educational resources and tools. Because ultimately the important thing is not what the report says, is what people do with it that counts.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm aware of time and your energy as well that you put into your presentation. But Colin, you had, maybe we could, Colin, could we take your question as the final one to Gwen and Andrei?
Well, hello everybody, and thanks for a wonderful presentation. I mean, it's fantastic work, but you've also explained it very beautifully and very clearly, and I really appreciate that. Many things I wanted to ask, but I'm going to focus on something a bit different, and that's the current state of conflict in the country. And I've been reading a little bit recently. The war is still going on, and it's got a whole new dimension, particularly in the Catatumbo region, which is bordering Venezuela. And there you bring in a whole other dimension because it becomes an international conflict. And, you know, Venezuela's not in a great state either, as everybody knows. So my simple questions are really, one, what is the government doing? Two, what are you doing? And three, what are other actors doing?
Humanitarian dialogues. Yeah.
Okay. You wanna?
You do it.
No, but
No.
Okay, thank you. No, that's and I can see that you've been doing a really important homework, and this is really important. Catatumbo is in the north of Colombia, as you rightly said, is in the border with Venezuela. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, since 2018, Colombia is facing 5 different armed conflicts. Colombia, for those of you who are not aware of the size of the country, Colombia is 3 times France. Okay, it's a huge country. 3 times France, and not only that, has 5 very different regions, like the Atlantic coast, the Pacific coast, the Andes that cut across the whole country, the Amazon jungle in the south, and the eastern plains that connect Colombia with Venezuela. Catatumbo is quite close to the eastern plains and in the last tip of the Andes. Catatumbo is a region in which the state has been absent forever. And in particular, the ELN, that is the National Liberation Army, has been controlling that region over the last 60 years. And in particular, when the FARC left and the FARC signed the peace process with the government, that became a stronghold of the ELN. And another small guerrilla group that has been almost destroyed called the EPL. So I'm not going to talk about that. And that region has been in dispute by some of the paramilitary groups called Clan del Golfo or Autodefensas Gaitanistas de Colombia that has tried to capture and fight against the ELN for the control of that territory because it's a really important drug trafficking route. Now, the reason why the paramilitary groups haven't been able to control that region is because the ELN operates in the border with Venezuela as a binational guerrilla group. So the ELN has got members and foot soldiers in Venezuela and has got the support of the Venezuelan authorities.
And some of them are Venezuelan.
And some of them are Venezuelan. Okay, so the ELN in that region behaves as a binational entity. And so what is the government doing? The government has started since 2022 a negotiation table with the ELN. So the government has said to the ELN, look, guys, you were trying to negotiate a peace agreement with previous President Juan Manuel Santos. When Duque came into power, those peace negotiations stopped. Now, we believe that the only way to bring development to the Catatumbo, to solve the problems of the campesinos in Catatumbo, and to dismantle the whole illegal armed trade that exists there is if we find a negotiated solution to the conflict with you guys. The ELN is an insurgency as old as the FARC. It was created in 1965. It sees itself as the last revolutionary Marxist-Leninist guerrilla group in the Western Hemisphere. And they feel that the FARC signed a peace agreement for too little. Now, so to get them into a negotiation table is already a big step forward, but to get to a final peace agreement is going to be the big challenge. Now, Uribe Santos, the President Santos, had 8 years to negotiate a peace agreement with the FARC. President Petro has only got 4 years because according to Colombian law, you cannot be re-elected anymore. So he has to try to strike a peace agreement with the ELN within the next 2 years in order to be able to try to start implementation. Now, that's what the government is doing. What are we doing? We are trying to support that peace agreement. That peace agreement has as one really important component a national committee for participation. It was created in the middle of the negotiations in Mexico last year. And the whole idea is that this National Committee for Participation is made of 81 different civil society organizations, bringing the business sector, bringing former members of the army that have joined organizations of civil society now, have indigenous organizations, Afro-Colombian organizations, women organizations. All these sectors of Colombian civil society are represented in this national committee. And they are trying to create a plan for national participation in Colombia over the next 12 months. The idea is that they want to bring people from all the regions of the country to create a mechanism for people to make proposals of what are the transformations that Colombia needs in order to find peace. We are supporting that. We are not one of the 81 organizations, but we've been working with some of them, helping them to start brainstorming about the participation mechanism that they want to create. And we've been doing workshops with some of them. Why are we doing this? Because as happened with the FARC and the President Santos, there are sectors of Colombian civil society who every single time that they see that there is a terrorist attack carried out by the ELN, when they see a kidnapping happening, like the father of the football player Luis Diaz, who plays in England, and I think that was a very famous news at the end of last year, when someone is kidnapped in Colombia by the ELN, these sectors of civil society come and say, you know what, stop peace negotiations and bomb the hell out of them and try to achieve a military solution. And we don't believe that that's a real solution because the suffering for civilians is humongous. So we are trying to counterbalance that. We're trying to keep faith in dialogue as the means for Colombia to find a way out of peace. Whether it's going to be possible or not, as Gwen said, is, I mean, we have learned in the last 11 years to stop having maximalist aspirations. We are very clear now that reality is imperfect, that we work with what life is offering. And so far, we believe that the negotiations between Petro and the ELN have had a good impact in terms of the humanitarian suffering of people. We've seen a reduction of internally displaced people, and we've seen not a reduction, but at least the killing of social leaders and the killing of former guerrilla members has stopped. Hasn't kept increasing as it was happening in the previous years, but at least has found a point of stopping. And we believe that with that, we can continue working over the next 2 years to try to create more hope among sectors of Colombian society who are skeptical and bring some support from outside Colombia with people like you and others to see that these peace efforts that President Petro is doing are not perfect, but are an example of how we should try as human beings to solve our conflicts, because the examples that we have in the Middle East and Ukraine are actually not working. They are not offering solutions. And what they are actually doing is just promoting force and the use of the military. And that's not really a solution. And I think for that reason, Petro is becoming a really important international leader, campaigning for peace in Palestine and Israel, campaigning for peace in Ukraine, is campaigning and inviting not only that, but to challenge the way how we're thinking about drugs. That is the illegal economy that is bringing lots of money to transnational organized crime and to the ELN, and to try to find a way forward.
I would summarize by saying, I think we dream, what's that nice saying? Shoot for the moon, you might reach the stars, or something like that. You know, it doesn't mean you stop having radical aspirations. You have to have radical hope and imaginings, but you also try to work at a small pragmatic level and kind of live on those two scales. But I think Andrei said a good response to that question. I won't say anymore. I think that's probably it from us. And thank you all for being so patient and for listening to us And again, really lovely to meet you all, and a pleasure to have this exchange.
Thank you so much. It's been absolutely inspiring. We just, thank you for your presentation. Thank you for all the resources that you put in the chat. Thank you for bringing us all to a knowledge of what you're doing in Colombia, your work in this country, the work of Winchester as well. And each in our own way can use all that we've learned tonight to ripple out through all the networks that we have, and to just continue to support in a tiny way or bigger ways, depending on our circumstances, for what you are doing. We wish you all the very best for your work in Colombia, and also for your new work, Gwen, in Edinburgh, and your continuing work, Andrei, in Winchester. It's been we are so grateful and inspired for what you've presented us with tonight. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Have a nice evening,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Shall I sign off?
Bye.
Yeah.
Brilliant.